At his lavish estate gala, the tycoon thought he was untouchable, belittling his wife in front of everyone to dazzle his gorgeous mistress. But when an unexpected guest stepped inside, someone with more influence than anyone guessed, everything turned upside down. What he exposed didn't just end the party, it demolished the tycoon's empire in a single, ruthless moment. The chandeliers glittered like constellations above polished marble floors, scattering rainbow flecks over the sea of tailored tuxedos and shimmering gowns filling the grand ballroom. The air was thick with wealth, expensive perfume, and secret rivalries wrapped in polite smiles. Every corner of the Crestwood Manor pulsed with laughter, clinking crystal, and the quiet power games of old fortune sizing up fresh ambition. At the heart of it all stood Marcus Langford, a glass of 30-year-old brandy in hand and the smug grin of a man certain the universe bowed to him. Marcus thrived in this world. CEOs, actors, influencers, each detail of tonight crafted to remind everyone just who controlled the room. Servers drifted like well-oiled machinery, balancing platters of caviar and flutes of champagne, slipping through circles of idle gossip camouflaged as compliments. None dared utter an insult about Marcus, not where he could hear it. His suit, custom-made in deep charcoal silk, gleamed softly under the chandeliers, fitting him like armor. Everything about him whispered power, admiration, envy. Draped at his side, one arm draped lightly over his, was Aria Monroe, the mistress, young, flawless, and poured into a satin dress that left no curve hidden. She absorbed the stares as greedily as Marcus did. Her lips glistened with gloss. Her laugh floated like music, perfected through endless practice in gilded mirrors. She clung to him like a prized possession, proof that money could keep time at bay. Together they were an exhibition, a carefully curated shock to spark envy, rumor, and above all to pierce the heart of one woman. Standing apart near the grand staircase was Helena, her posture regal, her face an unreadable mask. She drew attention not with glitter, but with the quiet poise she wore like a shield. Her gown, understated yet graceful, a deep burgundy classic that once made Marcus say she looked like a queen. That was long ago. Tonight she stood alone, a flute of mineral water in hand, unwilling to feed this night's intoxication any more than she had to. Her eyes roved over familiar faces and insincere grins. She knew exactly how Marcus planned this evening to unfold. It was never a party, it was a power play. A message from Marcus, loud, public, and perfectly staged. He had moved on, and to him she was nothing more than a finished, forgotten chapter. But Helena wasn't broken. She felt the sting, of course she did. Any woman would, watching the man she once loved flaunt another woman on his arm, catching the smug curl of his grin thrown her way. That cut deeper than any piece of the settlement she'd signed away in court. But she would never give him the pleasure of watching her come undone. Her grip on the slender glass tightened, but her lips stayed composed, and behind her eyes, thoughts flickered sharp and fast. This wasn't her world anymore, but she hadn't shown up by accident. She had accepted the invitation on purpose, not for old time's sake or self-punishment, but to remind herself just once why she'd chosen to abandon it all. And maybe, in some quiet corner of his mind, to remind him too. She was still standing. Marcus watched her from across the ballroom, the corner of his mouth twitching in a crooked, almost smile. "You see her?" he murmured to Arya, his voice low, dripping with amusement. Arya tilted her head following his line of sight. "The one in the burgundy gown?" "That's my ex-wife," he said, swirling his brandy with a smirk. "Didn't think she'd dare show up." Arya giggled softly, her eyes sweeping over Helena with a flicker of curiosity laced with smug confidence. "She's graceful." "She used to be," Marcus laughed, brushing off the compliment like dust on his cuff. "But she never really fit in here. Too proper, too quiet, couldn't keep pace." Arya nodded slowly, her smile hardening just a touch. She wasn't worried, she'd already won. Or so she believed. Across the grand hall, the band struck up another tune, and the hum of the party climbed higher. Guests danced, laughed, traded secrets and favors beneath glittering crystal and mirrored walls. Helena moved toward the terrace, craving a breath of cold night air. Passing clusters of well-dressed gossipers, she overheard bits of their chatter. Politics, mergers, someone's scandalous affair in Mykonos, another's impulsive purchase of a villa in Provence. All the things she once feigned interest in. She slipped outside and let out a quiet exhale. The night air grazed her skin like a gentle reminder that peace still existed beyond marble and champagne. Behind her, the sounds of revelry dulled into a distant echo. For a moment, she let her eyelids fall shut. A faint tremor she refused to show inside now curled in her chest, a knot of old hurt and new resolve threading together. The cold bit at her bare shoulders, but she welcomed it, letting it anchor her to the present. She knew this pain would pass, that she would not carry it home like she used to. Tonight was not about him. It was about remembering that she could stand alone and feel the wind without crumbling. Inside, Marcus kept the show alive. He worked the room, toasting the right people, dropping sly jokes at Helena's expense, thin insults coated in charm. Drinking in the sycophantic laughter of those desperate for his approval. She always despised these things, he said at one point, raising his glass again. Said the parties were shallow. Guess she was right. She never quite stood out. A ripple of laughter. One guest piped up, "Well, she certainly stands out now, just not the way she wants to." Marcus grinned, soaking up the reaction, but even as he laughed, something empty crept through the sound. His eyes drifted toward the terrace again, half expecting to catch Helena glancing back. She didn't. Arya leaned closer, her perfume clinging to him like a net. "You really don't miss her at all?" Marcus snorted dismissively. "She was safe, predictable. You're different. You've got ambition, fire." She clung to old-fashioned ideals. Marcus's voice dripped with flattery as he leaned closer to Arya. "You challenge me." Arya's smile stayed bright, but behind it, a flicker of unease flickered in her eyes. She'd heard that exact line before, about Helena. As the evening dragged on, Marcus's charm turned sharper. His digs more pointed, his mockery more blatant. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, chuckling out of politeness, uncertain whether they should. Eventually, Helena returned inside, offering a gentle smile to those who greeted her with the sort of forced sympathy that never quite reached their eyes. She felt the weight of every stare, heard the low murmurs slipping between champagne bubbles, yet she moved through it with unshakable poise, as if she didn't hear the cruelty swirling around her. When Marcus spotted her, he seized the moment like a dagger. He tapped his glass with a silver fork, the sharp chime slicing through the music. "Everyone," he called out, his voice rising above the hum of conversation. The band lowered their instruments. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. Helena froze mid-step. Marcus raised his glass high, his grin wide and cutting. A toast. To new beginnings, to growth, and to finally realizing that some people are born to shine while others simply fade away. A ripple of awkward laughter rolled through the room. The insult was no secret. It was cruelty disguised as wit, dressed up in crystal and champagne. Heat crept up Helena's neck as she felt every eye on her. But she didn't falter. Slowly, she lifted her own glass, gave a slight nod, and took a calm sip. It wasn't surrender. It was silent defiance, a declaration that she would not play his game. For a heartbeat, Marcus stumbled. Something foreign, discomfort, scratched at his chest. He smothered it quickly, pulling Arya closer, cracking another joke about how she brought real excitement back into his life. Helena turned from the circle of laughter and applause. Her fingers brushed the carved banister of the grand staircase as she glided past velvet curtains and vanished into the swirl of dancing bodies. Behind her, the party throbbed on, blind to the storm gathering quietly among whispered words and lingering stares. But something had shifted. For the first time, the murmurs were not about Helena, but Marcus himself. His arrogance, his ugly triumph. The invisible crackle of something about to snap buzzed in the air, like static before lightning. And just beyond the estate gates, beneath the soft spill of party lights, a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop. A man stepped out, smoothing the front of his suit, his face carved from stone, unreadable. He wasn't on the guest list. He didn't need to be. The night was far from over. It was far from over, just getting started, in fact. And now, let me ask you, if you were publicly humiliated by the very person who once vowed to love and protect you, what would you do? Walk away quietly? Or strike back in your own way? Drop your answer in the comments. Rate this story so far from 0 to 10, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe. You won't want to miss the twist that's still coming. The music floated through the Crestwood ballroom like a silk ribbon drifting through candlelight, graceful notes that softened the tension simmering just beneath polished conversations. Guests kept talking, but an invisible shift had settled over them. A few were still chuckling at Marcus's last remark, that sharp-edged toast aimed squarely at Helena, but more than a few had begun to glance at one another uneasily, silently wondering just how far the tycoon would push his little performance. The laughter no longer rang true. It sounded forced, brittle, polite noise to cover discomfort. But Marcus didn't seem to notice. He basked in it all, lost in the mirror of his own ego. In his mind, he towered over everyone, admired not only for his wealth, but for his so-called wit, his charm, and his brazen disregard for courtesy. Arya leaned against him, her manicured hand resting lightly on his chest, her gaze sweeping the glittering crowd for signs of admiration. She didn't sense the subtle crackle of unease yet, the faint, awkward hush building at the edges of the revelry. She only felt the thrill of standing at the side of the most powerful man in the room, and that alone made her feel untouchable, or so she thought. She tilted her head toward Marcus and murmured, "You really know how to hold an audience." Marcus smirked, tipping back his glass for another long sip. "That's power," he murmured. "People love a little scandal, keeps them awake." Across the ballroom, Helena lingered near an extravagant display of white hydrangeas and lilies, pretending to study the petals. But her eyes flicked constantly, absorbing every whisper, every uncomfortable smile. She saw it all, the way conversations flickered and shifted when Marcus passed by, the forced grin a woman gave him before leaning away, the slight shake of her companion's head. Helena had stood through 1,000 such parties. She knew the subtle signs of social decay, how it began with a whisper and could swell into a storm overnight. The delicate clink of metal on glass snapped her from her thoughts. Marcus had lifted his champagne flute again, tapping the rim with a polished silver spoon. The band quieted. Voices hushed, all eyes turned to him, just how he liked it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice echoing smoothly through the grand acoustics of Crestwood Manor. "Thank you all for being here tonight. What a magnificent night this is, wouldn't you agree?" Marcus's voice filled every corner of the Crestwood ballroom. A few polite claps trickled through the air and his grin widened. "I look around this room and I see power, beauty, ambition, everything that keeps our world spinning." He lifted his glass higher, letting the crystal catch the chandelier's glow. "But tonight, I want to make a special toast." He paused, eyes sliding deliberately to where Helena stood. Her pulse didn't skip, her breath didn't catch. She knew exactly where this was heading. "Moving forward," Marcus said smoothly, "recognizing that life is all about evolution, learning what no longer serves us and making space for what inspires us." A few polite chuckles fluttered through the hush. He beamed, feeding off the attention like a man starved for applause. Some people. His tone sharpened just enough for those nearest to shift uneasily. Some people cling to the past. They hold tight to old habits, tired ideas, stale relationships. But progress. He spread his arms grandly, turning slightly toward Arya, who gleamed up at him like a trophy on display. Progress means letting go. It means choosing what's fresh, alive, electrifying. He placed a gentle hand on Arya's back. "Like this remarkable woman beside me tonight, she reminds me what life should be, vibrant, unafraid of the ordinary." The sting of the words hit its mark. A blade slipped neatly under the ribs. But Helena didn't blink. Her expression stayed serene, her fingers steady on the delicate stem of her glass. The silence that followed should have been applause. Instead, it hung heavy, wrapping the guests in an uneasy hush. Marcus, either oblivious or willfully blind, pressed on. "To those of us who choose passion over routine, vision over comfort, and ambition over complacency." Scattered, half-hearted clinks followed. A few hesitant toasts, more than a few averted gazes. Helena let the moment wash over her. Then, unhurried, she lifted her glass to her lips, drank slowly, and placed it on a passing tray. Years beside a man like Marcus had taught her how to stand taller in moments meant to break her. She turned, stepped forward through the stunned hush, not to argue, not to spit words back at him, but simply to reclaim her space. Not with a speech, just with her presence. The band stumbled back into a tune, notes trembling at first before smoothing into familiar melody. Guests leaned in close to each other, desperate to mask the tension with small talk that barely stuck. A bandage over a wound everyone could still feel pulsing underneath. Arya glanced around, and for the first time she saw it too. The shift in the room's pulse, the tight smiles, the nervous glances exchanged over champagne rims. The toast hadn't dazzled, it had landed sharp and wrong. She edged closer to Marcus, voice low near his ear. "Do you think maybe that went too far?" Marcus blinked at her, confusion knitting between his brows. "Too far?" he scoffed. That was perfection? But even he could feel it now, the subtle drain in the air, the polite distance slipping like cold mist between him and his audience. It wasn't admiration staring back at him anymore, it was something else, something colder. A successful man could be arrogant, but a cruel man, a man who made others squirm, who mocked without shame or apology, that kind of cruelty didn't inspire envy, it turned admiration sour. One guest, an older gentleman in an impeccably cut charcoal suit, drifted near Helena by the dessert table. He didn't say much, he just gave her a quiet nod, a glance that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Sympathy. Respect. Maybe even regret that he hadn't stepped in earlier. She inclined her head back politely, not to invite pity, but to acknowledge the change around her. She wasn't here for approval, she was here for her dignity. And tonight, she had claimed it back by doing the simplest, hardest thing, standing her ground. Later, Arya, sensing the tension she didn't know how to ease, leaned close to Marcus and suggested a dance. Maybe, she thought, they could recapture the shine, the envy, the way people once gazed at them like royalty. Marcus obliged. He took her hand and led her to the center of the ballroom as a slow waltz began to swell from the grand piano. He smiled. For the cameras, for the crowd, for himself. But as they turned in perfect circles under the chandelier's dazzle, he caught his reflection in the gilded mirrors lining the walls. For a split second, he didn't know the man staring back. It wasn't triumph on that face. It was doubt. Not far away, Helena lingered by the fireplace, her fingertips resting lightly on the cool marble. She watched them spin, eyes unblinking, and she saw it. The hairline crack in Marcus's perfect mask, the small, undeniable fracture that doubt had wedged into his certainty. She turned and glided toward the main hall, where a fresh tray of champagne was being arranged by the staff. She lifted a flute, not to drink but to hold, to remain poised, to stay exactly where he least wanted her to be. Present. And then, just as the final notes of the waltz died, the music faded awkwardly into hush. A butler in black tails slipped discreetly through the entrance, a folded card in hand. He stepped up to Marcus and bent close enough for only him to hear. "Sir, a guest has just arrived." Marcus frowned, pulling Arya closer. "What guest? I wasn't expecting anyone else tonight." "He says it's urgent, sir. He asked me to deliver this to you personally." The butler offered the card. Marcus took it, flipped it open, and read the name. His jaw tensed. The card trembled faintly between his fingers, a name he hadn't read aloud in years. A ghost he thought he'd buried deep enough to forget. "Bring him in," Marcus said, his voice carefully stripped of emotion, though a tightness coiled at the base of his throat. Arya's brow furrowed. "Who is it?" Marcus didn't answer. His smile was gone now, stripped bare in front of 100 curious stares. As guests turned toward the entrance, the air changed yet again, not discomfort this time, but charged anticipation. Something was coming, something no one, least of all Marcus Langford, was ready to face tonight. The Crestwood ballroom gleamed beneath its crystal canopy, but a hushed stillness crept beneath the glitter. Conversations fluttered on, but they'd lost their warmth, their ease. Something was loosening at the seams, small but relentless. Even the self-absorbed pair spinning for applause felt it now, an itch under their skin that no wealth could soothe. Marcus still paraded Arya on his arm, but there was a stiffness to his shoulders now, a tight set to his jaw, the faintest crack in the armor of his arrogance. And Helena, though she stayed on the room's fringe, had quietly become the unspoken axis around which the entire evening now tilted. The murmurs drifting through the grand ballroom weren't just about her anymore. They were about him too. About Marcus Langford's venomous words, still clinging like stale wine on the tongues of guests, now uncertain where to look or what to say. Helena stood near the arched doorway that opened onto the garden. Her hand rested gently against the carved frame, as if she were weighing whether to step away from the noise for good. Her gaze swept the room, brushing against eyes that darted aside the moment they met hers. Sympathy flickering, then embarrassed retreat. One woman, cheeks flushed with secondhand shame, managed a strained apologetic smile. Helena returned a small nod, her face calm, collected, but inside something raw pressed like salt against a fresh wound. She could weather 1,000 cold stares. She could stand tall against rumors. But tonight, what cut deepest wasn't the public humiliation. It was the truth she couldn't ignore anymore. That Marcus, the man she'd once held close through endless nights of fear and doubt, now found amusement in using her as a joke. The garden air met her with unexpected bite, crisp, scented faintly with roses. Helena stepped onto the stone terrace, moving past tall planters overflowing with climbing ivy and blooms. Her heels clicked softly over the flagstones, grounding her. She didn't cry. She didn't rage at the night sky. She just leaned her back against the cold iron railing, staring out at the manicured lawn awash in golden uplighting. Her fingers curled tighter around the edge of the balustrade with every slow breath she drew. She wouldn't let herself unravel, not here, not in front of him. But the hollow ache in her chest made her wonder if it was even possible to stay whole anymore. The last time she'd stood here, it was their anniversary. Marcus had arranged a candlelit dinner beneath the stars, promising her she was his reason for everything, that he couldn't imagine building his world without her by his side. And now? Here she was, in the same place, watching him exalt another woman under the same heavens, praising progress and new beginnings, as if she'd been an anchor instead of the foundation beneath every one of his triumphs. Helena clenched her fists, her pulse flickering at her throat. She wasn't just angry at him. She was furious with herself, for believing him, for defending him when he crushed competitors without mercy, for dimming her own light so his could blaze bigger. The soft rhythm of approaching footsteps snapped her back to the terrace. A voice followed, familiar but grating in this moment. "I was wondering where you'd slipped off to," Arya said gently, stepping out under the terrace lights, her gown trailing behind her like molten gold. Helena didn't respond right away. She kept her eyes on the far edge of the lawn, fingers still pressed white-knuckled to the railing. Helena stayed perfectly still, her eyes locked on the dark lawn beyond the railing, as if Arya's presence might evaporate if ignored long enough. But the younger woman in the gleaming gold gown drifted closer anyway, a faintly smug smile playing on her lips. "You know," Arya began, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, "you really handled that toast with grace. If I were you, I'd probably have thrown a drink in his face, or two." Helena turned toward her slowly, her voice steady and low. "That's the difference between you and me. I don't cause scenes just to earn applause." Arya's smile twitched, faltered, a crack in the polished confidence. "No offense, but if I were in your shoes, I wouldn't have come at all." "I'm not in your shoes," Helena said evenly, "and thank God for that." Arya let out a nervous laugh, caught between retreat and bravado. She shifted her weight, then added, "Marcus says you always hated parties like this, that you never really understood the life he was meant for." Helena turned fully to face her then, voice calm but cutting. "Marcus says a lot of things when he wants an audience. Doesn't make them true." A pause settled between them, tight and brittle like a thread on the verge of breaking. "You must miss it," Arya ventured, her eyes flicking back to the ballroom, glowing behind them. "The lifestyle, the attention." "I miss the woman I was before I let any of that matter," Helena answered without hesitation. "I don't miss him. And I don't miss pretending to be smaller so he could feel larger." Arya stared back, and for the first time there was no smug tilt to her smile. Instead, uncertainty, maybe even discomfort. For a moment, the woman she dismissed as the quiet, polite ex-wife stood before her as something else entirely, unshaken, unafraid. It rattled her more than she expected. "I should get back inside," Arya said, her tone awkward, turning quickly on her heel. Helena watched her slip back into the glow of the party, then turned her gaze to the garden once more. Her heartbeat steadied, her resolve hardening like stone set in concrete. She wasn't the fragile ghost Marcus described in his cruel toast. She wasn't fading. She wasn't clinging to the past. She was taking herself back, quietly, unflinchingly, with every breath she drew outside that room filled with forced laughter and shallow praise. A few minutes later, another guest joined her on the terrace. A woman Helena barely remembered from a charity auction years ago. "I just wanted to say, you carried yourself with real grace tonight," the woman said softly. "I'm sorry about what he did. It was cruel." Helena gave her a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, but you don't have to be sorry. I'm not." Inside, Marcus caught sight of Arya returning to his side. She was quieter now, her drink untouched for once, her eyes occasionally drifting over the guests with a restlessness he didn't bother to question. He didn't ask what had passed between them. He wouldn't have liked the answer. Marcus assumed Arya just needed a moment alone to catch her breath. But when she didn't laugh at his next joke, when she glanced away as he tossed out another cutting remark about Helena, something tugged at him. He couldn't name it yet, but it scratched at the edges of his composure in a way that made him uneasy. Across the ballroom, Helena reappeared on the main floor, not to reclaim some stolen spotlight, but simply to be seen on her own terms. She moved with the same unshaken grace she'd always possessed. Even the waitstaff, gliding past with fresh trays of champagne, shifted subtly to give her space, treating her presence with a newfound respect. There was no dramatic entrance, no pointed confrontation, no clever speech to counter Marcus's cruel humor. Just her silence, her dignity, her quiet refusal to be erased. And people noticed, and the more they noticed her, the less they laughed at Marcus's barbed stories. As the night stretched deeper, a new hum threaded through the marble halls, not born of the band's music or shallow gossip, but of an unspoken anticipation. A sense that something inevitable was pressing at the seams, about to tip everything sideways. The laughter drifting through the Crestwood ballroom had grown thin. What once pulsed through the mansion like electricity now rang false, forced. Guests chuckled more out of habit than delight. The crackling excitement that had dazzled the early hours had dulled into a hollow routine. But Marcus, drunk on his own narrative, remained oblivious. He stood near the grand staircase, spinning a tale about his latest acquisition, swirling his wine glass dramatically while Arya nodded along, her smile strained at the corners. Even she was beginning to taste the shift beneath the polished surface. The way people drifted off quicker, how the servers avoided lingering within his orbit too long. Then came the ripple. Small, almost invisible at first. A muted commotion near the front entrance, a quiet word between the head butler and a suited man at the gate. Most guests didn't notice, lost in their drinks and polite small talk. But a few, the older investors, the boardroom veterans, the ones with a sixth sense for tension, felt the current change. They turned, eyes narrowing. The head butler crossed the ballroom briskly, his usual calm replaced by a controlled urgency. He bent close to Marcus and offered a folded card, voice low. Marcus took it with a dismissive flick of his wrist, still half in his story, but the smirk he wore dissolved the instant his eyes caught the name inside. He stared. Too long. His other hand lowered, the glass following like an afterthought as his mind scrambled to catch up with what his body already knew. Arya leaned in, her voice a hush against the hum of conversation. "What is it?" Marcus didn't answer. He slipped the card back into his pocket, shoulders stiffening as if bracing against an invisible wind. He forced a laugh. Loud, hollow, empty. Nothing. Just an unexpected surprise. Arya's brow creased, catching the tension flickering behind his eyes. A surprise guest? Something like that, Marcus muttered. Before she could press further, the double doors at the entrance swung open again. A man stepped in, tall, calm, exuding a confidence that didn't need to be announced. His tailored charcoal gray suit fit like a second skin. He didn't pause to scan the crowd or drink in the grandeur. He walked forward as if the entire house had been built for him alone. His steps were steady and intentional. Nothing about him was showy or forced. Yet somehow, as he crossed the threshold, conversation tapered off, eyes drifting toward him as though pulled by an invisible cord. There was a quiet gravity in how he moved, a calm authority that didn't clamor for attention but commanded it anyway. His hair was dusted with streaks of silver at the temples, his jawline defined, his expression neutral yet undeniably self-assured. He didn't smile, he didn't nod or wave, he simply walked deeper into the Crestwood ballroom, unfazed by the hush that rolled through the room like a soft tremor. Whispers flickered through the guests like sparks. "Who is that? Is he on the list? I thought no one else was coming." Marcus's smile pinched tight at the corners as he stepped forward, placing himself directly in the newcomer's path. Arya lingered behind him, her eyes narrowing, curiosity shading into unease. "Victor Langston," Marcus called, his voice pitched higher than normal, straining for casual warmth. "What an unexpected pleasure." Victor extended a hand, calm, solid, unhurried. "Marcus?" Marcus clasped it, squeezing just a little too hard. "You weren't on the guest list," he said through a too tight grin, each word shaped carefully to sound polite. Victor's reply was smooth, his tone resonant yet calm. "I don't remember ever needing an invitation, but I appreciate the welcome." Marcus forced a short, brittle laugh. Of course. There's always room for old friends." "Funny," Victor said, his eyes steady, voice level. "I never thought we were friends." Nearby guests pretended to busy themselves with canapes and champagne, but every ear bent closer, every eye stole quick glances at the unfolding exchange. Arya moved closer to Marcus's side, forcing a polite smile as she extended her hand. "Arya Monroe." Victor shook her hand with the same composed courtesy, offering only a faint nod. "Pleasure." But he didn't linger on her, nor did he study the glittering hall like a man newly arrived. His gaze had already found Helena. Across the polished floor she stood still, her face unreadable but her posture subtly shifted. Shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes locked on his. The recognition between them was quiet but unmistakable, and guests, ever hungry for gossip, turned to look at her too, as if trying to piece together an invisible thread that bound her to the man who had just unsettled the host without uttering a threat. Marcus saw it, felt it coil tight in his chest. He forced a chuckle that caught at the edge. "You know Helena?" he asked, straining for offhand surprise but missing the mark, the edge in his voice too sharp. Victor didn't look at him. "Yes." Marcus's fingers clenched around his glass. "How well?" Victor turned back then, calm as ever, unbothered, the faintest flicker of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well enough." The words landed with a quiet finality that needed no embellishment. It wasn't what he said, it was how effortlessly he said it, as though Marcus's question didn't warrant anything more elaborate, as though his connection to Helena was not up for Marcus to frame. The air shifted again. The audience, all those carefully curated guests, grew quieter still, as if some unscripted truth was beginning to seep through the crystal and silk. The band, sensing it without being told, softened their playing to a faint, polite hum. And suddenly, the energy that had once clung to Marcus and Arya shifted, drawn instead toward the silent axis between Helena and Victor. Marcus felt it, a hollow space where his control had lived just moments before. For the first time that night, Marcus Langford didn't know what to say. He parted his lips, then closed them again. A forced chuckle sputtered out, brittle and misplaced, before he stepped aside, clearing Victor's path with a stiff gesture. "Well, enjoy the party. Plenty of wine, plenty of whatever it is you're after." Victor didn't bother replying. He simply moved past Marcus without a glance back, his stride steady, purposeful, unhurried, until he reached Helena. He didn't pull her close. He didn't take her hand. He just stood beside her, and their silence said more than any greeting ever could. Guests nearby pretended to chatter, but their eyes clung to the pair like moths to a flame, the puzzle coming together in whispers and stolen glances. "You look radiant," Victor said, his voice low enough to belong only to her. "I didn't expect to see you here," Helena replied, her tone calm but layered with something softer beneath. "You should have," he murmured. "I told you I'd come when the time was right." Her lips curved at the edges, not quite a smile, but enough to reveal that she understood. Between them there was no strain, no confusion, just a quiet familiarity, a trust that needed no explanation for anyone else. Across the ballroom, Marcus watched, his eyes locked, his jaw clenched so tight the tendons at his temple twitched. His hand tightened around the stem of his scotch glass until the crystal groaned in protest. Arya leaned in, her voice barely above the hum of the subdued band. "Who is he really?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He kept staring, as if by sheer force he could will Victor to vanish. Finally, under his breath, almost to himself, he muttered, "Trouble." But even that was far too simple for what Victor Langston truly was. He hadn't come for champagne or the glittering atmosphere. He had come with purpose. And though Marcus didn't fully grasp it yet, this was the thread that would start to unravel everything he had so carefully wrapped around himself. Some guests brought toasts and polite gifts. Others brought consequences. The grand ballroom never regained its earlier rhythm after Victor's arrival. It was as if the night had slipped into another realm. The music softer, the air heavier, the polite chatter reduced to murmurs that stumbled and restarted, never quite finding their stride. People forced laughs that fizzled too soon, darting glances toward the small axis forming around Helena and Victor. The real heart of the evening now, whether Marcus admitted it or not. An irreversible shift had happened. The easy luxury had curdled into a quiet, restless tension. And as Marcus stood near the bar, gripping his fourth scotch of the night, its heat did nothing to restore the control, slipping through his fingers. Arya hovered at his side, sensing the chill creeping in under all the chandeliers and forced smiles. Arya couldn't tell whether she should be worried or entertained. Marcus, meanwhile, didn't speak for several moments, just stood there, his stare locked on Victor across the ballroom. He hadn't done anything flashy, no dramatic entrance, no cutting speech, just polite words and calm presence. And yet, somehow, he'd managed to tilt the entire night on its axis. That was the kind of influence Marcus despised most, the quiet kind, the kind you couldn't buy or brandish like a trophy, the kind that grew from earned respect and the unsettling power of unspoken intent. "You going to tell me who he really is?" Arya finally pressed, her voice low but sharp with curiosity. Marcus tipped back his scotch and downed what was left in a single swallow before answering. "Victor Langston," he said, each syllable clipped and bitter. "He's a heavyweight investor, controls major stakes in biotech, renewable infrastructure, media, you name it." Arya's brows lifted. "And why would he crash your party?" Marcus didn't reply right away. His eyes flicked from her back to Victor and Helena, standing together like a quiet storm no one could look away from. "That," he said under his breath, "is exactly what I plan to find out." At that moment, Victor stepped toward the small platform near the grand piano where a few guests were lingering with plates of hors d'oeuvres. He tapped the rim of a wineglass with a fork, a clear, crisp ring that sliced neatly through the low hum of conversations. Heads turned like sunflowers to light. The band stumbled to a halt mid-measure. Even the staff froze, trays poised mid-air. Victor offered a mild, courteous smile, his voice calm and polished. "Apologies for the interruption. I realize I wasn't on tonight's invitation list, but I simply couldn't resist joining such an illustrious gathering." A polite ripple of laughter swept through the guests. But before it could settle, Victor's tone shifted, still calm but honed to a fine point. "Truth is, I came not merely to celebrate, but to share a few words that may interest those in this room who pride themselves on market dominance and aggressive expansion." Marcus's spine stiffened. His shoulders squared so suddenly Arya felt it before she saw it. He recognized that tone. It wasn't for social niceties. It was the tone Victor used when he was about to gut an opponent with facts and leave the carcass for the press to pick clean. Victor Langston wasn't here for wine or music. He was here to deliver a message, and everyone could feel it. "As many of you already know," Victor continued smoothly, "my firm, Langston Holdings, has served as a primary financial pillar behind numerous high-profile corporate endeavors for more than a decade now." A hush fell even deeper as he went on. "One of those ventures, of course, includes Langford Consolidated, the empire stewarded by our gracious host this evening." The air thickened until it almost seemed to hum with static. Guests shifted where they stood, trading uneasy glances, uncertain whether to look at Victor or Marcus. The king now forced to stand silent, while another man held the court. Behind raised hands, whispers flared like sparks in dry grass. Marcus forced a laugh, loud, brittle, and painfully out of place. "Well, I see you're handling the introductions for me tonight, Victor." Victor turned his head slightly, the same mild smile anchored in place. "Just ensuring clarity. Transparency is everything these days." Then, without missing a beat, he faced the guests again. "Over the past few months, however, we at Langston Holdings have been thoroughly re-evaluating our investment strategies. reassessing long-term partnerships and focusing our capital on companies where true innovation and integrity still thrive. He paused, his tone crisp but unhurried. Unfortunately, not all partnerships make the cut. Even Arya's face tensed at that. Marcus went still, fingers whitening around the rim of his scotch glass as if it were the only thing holding him upright. He stepped forward, grasping at the last scraps of control. "I think that's enough," Marcus snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Victor raised a hand, not aggressive, but commanding enough to freeze Marcus in place. "Actually, Marcus, I'm not quite done." The silence pressed down, thick and immovable. Not a single fork or glass clinked. All eyes stayed locked on Victor. "Effective immediately," Victor said clearly, each word ringing through Crestwood like a gavel. "Langston Holdings will be withdrawing all investments from Langford Consolidated. All funding, all support, all affiliations terminated." A collective gasp tore through the ballroom, uncontrolled, instinctive. 100 questions detonated in the minds of the guests all at once. What does this mean? Why announce it here? How bad is this really? Marcus's face drained of color. His mouth fell open but found no words to fill it. Beside him, Arya shifted back a step, as if putting distance between herself and a blast no one could yet see, but everyone felt. Victor, unmoved, continued. This decision was not made lightly. He angled slightly, letting more of the room see him directly. It comes after a comprehensive review of business ethics, leadership conduct, and the long-term sustainability of projects overseen by Marcus Langford. We concluded that maintaining this partnership would no longer align with our principles or our strategic goals. Murmurs rose now, louder than before. Across the hall, people fumbled for phones, screens glowing as they searched for breaking headlines, confirmation, statements, anything to make sense of what had just detonated in front of them. Marcus could feel it. The ground beneath him splitting open, the polished floor of Crestwood fracturing in ways no wealth or charm could patch back together tonight. "You could have called," Marcus hissed, leaning in, his voice strangled with restrained fury. "I could have," Victor agreed smoothly. "But I wanted the message to be clear, not just to you, but to everyone you choose to keep at your side." Then Victor turned, his expression softening just enough as his gaze fell on Helena. "There's one more thing I'd like to say before I go." The room froze again. Marcus turned, stiff as stone, to look at Helena, who stood as she had all night, calm, steady, her expression giving nothing away. She didn't look the least bit surprised. Helena didn't look rattled. If anything, she looked composed, a calm in the eye of a gathering storm. Victor turned back to the guests, his voice carrying the same steady authority that had silenced the room moments before. "I've had the privilege of working alongside many remarkable minds in my career, but few have impressed me the way Helena has. Her insight, her integrity, her ability to see beyond profit margins and into the true heart of leadership." He paused as another wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. "That's the kind of vision I respect." Now every pair of eyes was pinned squarely on Helena. "I've invited her to join my board of directors," Victor continued, "and I'm honored to announce tonight that she's accepted." The reaction was instant. Marcus recoiled half a step, his jaw slackening so visibly that Arya instinctively reached for his arm. His voice came out as a strangled whisper. You what?" Helena finally spoke. Her tone wasn't loud, but every syllable landed like a gavel. "You always said I didn't belong in this world, Marcus. Turns out you were right. I belong in one better." With those words, the entire night split apart. Gasps erupted, phones lifted, cameras flashed, and in an instant, the story was no longer about Marcus's extravagant gala or the woman draped on his arm. It was about Helena, the wife he had mocked and dismissed, now standing at the fulcrum of a power shift so sharp it left him breathless. Marcus struggled to inhale, his hands trembling around the rim of his glass. His throat burned dry. He looked at Arya, who had gone as pale as the champagne in her flute, realization dawning that this moment wasn't just about business anymore. It was about betrayal, about every underestimation of the woman he had thought he could silence. The same woman who had quietly, piece by piece, flipped the entire narrative on him. The grandeur of Crestwood still glittered overhead, chandeliers raining down prismatic light, the orchestra striking up a polite waltz, but it was all hollow now. Music that no longer stirred admiration, but floated like static over a room that had moved on. Guests began whispering more openly now. Murmurs broke into restless questions. Then questions hardened into polite excuses and hasty goodbyes. One by one, people drifted toward the exits, their practiced smiles doing little to hide their urgency to escape the souring spectacle. Marcus stood frozen, the weight of humiliation coiling tight around his ribs. His drink hung slack at his side, forgotten. He stared across the marble floor at Helena, the woman he had ridiculed hours before, and every labored breath seemed to carry the bitter taste of his own undoing. Behind him, Arya hovered awkwardly, her posture no longer regal but defensive, her eyes darting to every corner of the ballroom she could not control. She saw it clearly now, the quiet fracture in the crowd. The same investors and socialites who had worshipped Marcus's charisma an hour ago now averted their eyes, glued themselves to phones, to half-empty glasses, to anything but him. Marcus snapped out of it just long enough to whirl around and storm toward the bar, waving down the nearest server with an urgency that betrayed him completely. He needed another drink, and maybe something stronger to drown out the echo of the only story this night would ever be remembered for. Helena's. The bartender, clearly rattled, hesitated before pouring. The crystal glass hit the bar with a louder-than-needed thud, and Marcus downed it in a single swallow, the liquor burning uselessly against the chill crawling up his spine. "Unbelievable," he hissed, bracing himself against the edge of the bar until his knuckles whitened. "She played me. They played me. That bastard Langston and her. They've been orchestrating this together." Arya approached cautiously, her heels clicking across the marble floor like distant gunfire echoing in a cavern. "Marcus, maybe we should go. This party, it's over. People are leaving." Marcus spun on her, his eyes feverish, voice cracking under the strain. "I don't care if they leave. Let them. Parasites, every last one of them. They were never loyal to me. They were loyal to the image, to the power I let them worship. And now? Now they pretend they don't even know me?" Arya lowered her voice, glancing nervously at the few stragglers nearby. "It's not just them. Investors are pulling out. I overheard someone say the stock is already dipping. People are panicking, Marcus." He scoffed, a sound half snarl, half laugh. "That's impossible. It's after hours." "It doesn't matter," Arya cut in softly but firmly. "Rumors move faster than the truth, and by tomorrow morning you know damn well what the headlines will be." Marcus barked a curse under his breath. Lass shoved past her so hard she stumbled a step to the side. He barely registered the small knot of guests huddled awkwardly near the fountain. They scattered at the sight of him, conversations breaking off mid-sentence as he stormed by. He made straight for the hallway that led to his sanctuary. The library. The one place left in Crestwood where he could pretend the walls still belonged to him alone. The room was dim, lined floor to ceiling with towering bookshelves he rarely touched, littered with antique globes and heavy leather chairs polished more than sat in. He closed the doors behind him, the muffled music from the ballroom cut off in a heartbeat. He leaned back against the carved wood, eyes squeezed shut, breath ragged in his chest. He could feel the weight of everything he'd clawed his way up from. The years spent muscling his way into rooms that once slammed doors in his face, the hours spent memorizing every cruel rule of power and prestige. But now the air felt thick and sour around him. His pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the faint echoes of laughter still drifting in from the hall. He wanted to smash something, to tear apart the leather chairs, to rip books from their spines, but he couldn't move. All that ferocity coiled inside him with nowhere to go except deeper, turning into something sharp and choking. But now, someone else had rewritten the rules while he was too busy basking in his own reflection to notice. He wasn't ready for this. A war fought in hushed words and calculated silence, in headlines and whispered rumors, in the subtle pivot of loyalty from one empire to another. Helena hadn't needed venom, or theatrics, or an audience begging for scandal. She had wielded timing, dignity, silence, the three weapons he had underestimated most. Outside the closed doors, the ballroom continued to bleed guests. More polite excuses, more empty praise murmured to Arya by those too embarrassed to linger, more brisk nods as people made for the exits, without looking back. The staff exchanged quiet glances as they cleared half-finished glasses and abandoned plates, moving a little faster now, sensing that the night and the world that hosted it was coming to an end. Sooner than anyone expected, the chef had already begun boxing up leftovers in the kitchen. Near the stage, one musician leaned toward another and muttered under his breath, "Feels like the Titanic." Meanwhile, Arya lingered by the bar, nursing a half-finished glass of wine she no longer even wanted. She watched it all unravel, realizing too late that she'd stepped into something far more dangerous than a love affair or a gilded social climb. She had attached herself to a man whose empire was teetering on a ledge, and worse, she couldn't tell anymore where she fit in his list of priorities. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Another message from a reporter she'd ignored earlier. Now they came in floods. Questions, requests for statements, some prying for dirt on her involvement with Langford Consolidated, others more invasive, wanting details about her relationship with Marcus. She locked the screen, her fingers trembling slightly. The shine of being the new woman had dulled to rust in a single night. She glanced around the nearly empty ballroom. The flicker of crystal chandeliers now looked cheap, desperate. The people who had once complimented her dress envied her place at Marcus's side. They were gone, their fake adoration swept away like confetti after a parade. For the first time since she'd stepped into this life, she wondered if she had ever really owned any of it, or if she'd just been a decoration Marcus used until he didn't need her shine anymore. Inside the library, Marcus paced like a trapped animal. He ripped a heavy hardcover off a shelf and hurled it across the room. It slammed against the wood paneling and thudded lifelessly onto the carpet. "How could I not see this?" he snarled, pacing faster. She played the long game, waited, watched, bided her damn time. And I let her. I invited her in tonight. I thought I was humiliating her, proving a point. His laugh cracked apart. She was 10 steps ahead the whole time. He slammed his fists onto the polished desk. A crystal pen holder toppled, scattering paper across the floor. The fury blazing in his eyes flickered now with something rawer, fear. Real fear. Not of Helena's win, but of his own fall. Decades spent building a fortress of power and perception, every carefully curated handshake, every whispered deal, all unraveling, not by scandal or betrayal, but by the simple truth that he was no longer untouchable. In his world, that perception was the power. He snatched up his phone and started dialing, his CFO, his lawyer, his PR chief, desperate to plug the holes before they swallowed him whole. One after another, voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. Each empty beep on the line was louder than a slammed door. They were stepping away, protecting their own names. He wasn't the axis anymore. He was dead weight dragging them down. Behind him, the library doors creaked open. Arya stepped inside, her heels muffled by the thick Persian rug. "Marcus, we need to talk." He whirled on her, ragged, eyes wide. "About what? About us? About this? Now?" "I think now is exactly the time," she said, her voice calm but edged with something harder than before. "Because I need to know where I stand. If this all comes crashing down, I need to know I'm not just another accessory you drop when it's convenient." Arya's pulse hammered at her throat, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. Somewhere deep down, she still wanted him to lie. To say she mattered more than the fortune collapsing around them. But the silence that filled the room told her everything. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because he hadn't thought about it, not once. She had been part of the show, the illusion, the trophy for the stories he wanted people to believe. And now, with the story in ruins, she stood before him asking for something real from a man who suddenly had no foundation beneath him. She exhaled, her posture softening, but her resolve firm. "I'm going home, Marcus. Call me when you figure out what actually matters to you." With that, Arya turned, walked out of the library, out of Crestwood Manor, and out of the carefully crafted narrative that had once made her feel invincible. She didn't slam the door. She didn't raise her voice, she just left. And in her absence, Marcus felt the house grow quieter. Darker, colder than it had felt in years. Outside, the last of the luxury cars rolled down the drive, the echo of departing engines fading behind the tall iron gates. Inside Crestwood Manor, the chandeliers still burned bright overhead, but their glow felt fake now, like stage lights forgotten after the actors had abandoned the scene. And Marcus, standing alone amid the wreckage of his own grand illusion, finally began to understand. This wasn't just a bad night. This was the opening scene of his downfall. By the time the final car disappeared down the drive and the gates locked shut behind it, silence settled over Crestwood like a heavy fog. The party was over, in every sense. The staff moved quietly through the marble halls, gathering half-empty glasses and discarded napkins, their soft footfalls echoing louder than the once triumphant orchestra. The chandeliers, so dazzling hours ago, now cast more shadow than light. What had been planned as a glittering testament to his power was now nothing but an elegant ruin. Marcus remained in his study, staring at the bottom of an empty whiskey glass, the last warmth in it long gone. Upstairs, Arya was packing. Her heels clicked sharply along the marble corridor as she strode to the bedroom, her composure still intact for anyone who might see her, but cracking the instant she shut the door behind her. Alone, she leaned against the wall, her breath shaky, her clutch sliding from her hand to the carpet. She wasn't sure what she felt. Fear? Shame? Raw anger? Maybe all of it, twisted into a knot she couldn't untangle. An hour ago, she had been the glittering centerpiece at the side of a man everyone envied. Now she felt like a stage prop, a pretty decoration being packed away after a show no one wanted to see again. And she hated that. She crossed to the closet in 3 quick strides, yanked out her suitcase and threw it open with a practiced flick of her wrist. Dresses, shoes, cosmetics, all flung in one after another, no care for neatness. A pair of diamond earrings tumbled after a silk slip, a crystal perfume bottle thudded against her velvet jewelry box. She paused only once, catching her reflection in the tall mirror. What stared back looked unfamiliar. Lipstick smudged, hair out of place, eyes wide with something that shimmered too close to panic. What had she gotten herself into? She had believed Marcus was untouchable. She had believed that attaching herself to him meant stepping onto the shoulders of a giant. But now, the foundation was cracking, and she could feel every tremor shivering up her spine. In that image, Victor Langston beside Helena wouldn't leave her head. The finality in his calm voice, the way he didn't bluff or posture, just pure, quiet authority. And Helena had stood there like royalty among broken crowns. Arya had expected bitterness, pettiness, a woman defeated and pitiful. Instead, she'd seen grace under fire, composure with no act to maintain. And in that quiet poise, Arya realized for the first time that the throne she thought she'd claimed had never been real at all. It made her feel cheap, not her clothes, not her makeup, but her purpose. Arya zipped her suitcase with a sharp, violent tug, the sound slicing through the stillness of the room like a blade. Her phone buzzed again on the dresser. Another message, this one from a friend who'd been at Crestwood hours ago. A link to a breaking news alert. Investor pulls funding publicly at Langford Gala. Company value plummets overnight. She didn't bother opening it. The headline alone told her everything she needed to know. She sank onto the edge of the bed for a moment, pressing her palms to her temples. The glitter, the whispers, the way people had stared at her in envy, gone in a snap. In this silence, she realized she didn't even know what she'd been fighting for. Power? Validation? A seat next to a man who hadn't once asked what she wanted for herself? The hollowness of it clawed at her throat. A knock broke the silence, soft, hesitant. Arya. Marcus's voice was raw, worn down by panic and whiskey. She didn't answer right away. She stared at the door, pulse hammering at her temples, unsure whether she even wanted to hear whatever came next. The knock came again, just a little louder. "I just need to talk," he said. She cracked the door open just enough for him to see her face. His eyes found hers immediately, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a lost confusion, like a man still trying to wake up from a nightmare he'd scripted for himself. "I'm leaving," she said plainly. His eyes dropped to the suitcase behind her, half-packed and unapologetic. "So? That's it? What did you expect?" She shot back, keeping her voice even. "That I'd stay here tonight and pretend none of this happened? I didn't plan any of this." He scrubbed a hand over his face, breath unsteady. "I didn't know Helena would. I didn't even know Victor was coming." "That's the problem, Marcus." She stepped back a fraction, putting space between them even with the door half closed. "You never know. You just assume. You assumed you could drag your wife through the mud in front of half the city and walk away untouched. You assumed no one would call you out. You assumed you were untouchable. His jaw clenched. I didn't ask you to get tangled in this. No, her tone sharpened, the last shred of warmth cooling into frost. But you didn't mind flaunting me like some trophy while you humiliated her. You used me to hurt her, and look how well that worked out for you. A flicker of regret twisted in her chest, sharp and pointless. She hated that part of her, still wanted him to say she mattered, to beg her to stay. But she knew better now. His fists tightened at his sides. So you're just gonna run? I'm not running. Her voice was calm, merciless in its finality. I'm choosing not to drown with a sinking ship. He let out a short, bitter laugh, stepping back a pace. Wow, so much for all that talk about ambition and partnership. The minute it gets hard, you disappear. I never signed up to clean up your mess, Arya snapped, her voice cutting sharper than she intended. I signed up for a future, not for a collapse. She shut the door firmly and locked it, sealing him out. Marcus stood on the other side, frozen for a heartbeat by the finality in her tone. Then he turned away, steps slow and aimless, drifting back to the study, leaving only silence behind them. Inside the room, Arya dragged her suitcase off the bed and rolled it toward the door. Her heels echoed down the hallway as she descended Crestwood's grand staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the bottom, she paused in the foyer. She let her eyes sweep over the expensive artwork, the soaring ceilings, the glittering chandeliers that once dazzled her into believing she'd stepped into a fairy tale. Now it all felt like a cage she couldn't wait to leave behind. For a fleeting second, she wondered if she'd ever truly belonged here, or if she'd only been a prop, polished and displayed under golden lights until the story no longer needed her. The sting of it sharpened her spine. Better to walk away now than cling to scraps of a lie. She stepped out into the cold night air. It hit her cheeks like a slap, bracing and honest. Her driver was already waiting at the curb. She gave him a short nod, and he opened the car door. As the car pulled away from Crestwood Manor, Arya didn't look back. She didn't want to. She didn't need to. Whatever dream she thought she'd claimed inside those walls, it wasn't hers anymore. Inside, Marcus drifted through the empty halls like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own legend. The echo of her footsteps still clung to the marble floors long after she'd gone. The staff moved quickly now, clearing half-drained glasses, sweeping up stray petals, their eyes politely averted when he passed by. His phone buzzed and buzzed, board members demanding explanations, journalists hungry for quotes, lawyers flagging urgent meetings. He didn't answer. He stared at the screen as if it belonged to someone else. As if the empire teetering on collapse was not the same one he'd built from ruthless ambition and ego. In the reflection of the floor-to-ceiling windows, he caught sight of himself. His tie hung askew, his shirt rumpled, his eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness and the shock of being dethroned in a single night. He looked like a man who had been aged decades by a few brutal hours. A man who was finally meeting the reckoning he'd always believed he was too clever to face. A dry laugh scraped his throat, but died before it left his lips. He had thought power was armor, that charm and money could buy him endless second chances. Now the truth was staring back at him in the glass. Stripped bare, ordinary, irrelevant, without the empire propping him up. He sank into one of the velvet chairs in the center of the ballroom. Around him lay the wreckage of his perfect night. Empty glasses, trampled petals, abandoned shawls, ghosts of a celebration that had never been real. He tipped his head back to stare at the chandeliers, still blazing above him. For the first time, their glow didn't make him feel invincible. It made him feel small, insignificant beneath their cold light. He had mocked the woman who stood by him for years. He had weaponized another woman to wound her. He had built a castle on a foundation already cracking beneath his own arrogance. And now, alone in the vast, echoing emptiness of Crestwood Manor, Marcus Langford finally faced what he'd spent his entire life refusing to see: consequences. Morning arrived, not with solace, but with the pitiless glare of exposure. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Crestwood, flooding the marble floors with gold, but there was no warmth in it, only harsh illumination, revealing everything the velvet night had hidden. The house was still. No laughter, no clinking glasses, no footsteps echoing through its grand halls. Only silence, heavy and suffocating. The faint scent of champagne lingered in the drapes. A silk wrap lay draped over a chair, abandoned. A bouquet sagged in its vase, its petals bruised and wilting. Marcus sat alone in his study, the same place he'd run to when the walls first began to crack. But this morning, the walls didn't feel protective anymore. They felt closer, smaller, like a cage of his own making, pressing in on every side. His phone screen pulsed relentlessly with new alerts. Breaking headlines, urgent messages piling up like snowdrifts he couldn't shovel fast enough. He didn't need to open them. He already knew. His name, his company's name, was everywhere, blazing across every business channel, stitched into trending hashtags, looped through talk shows and financial reports. Investor pulls out at Langford Gala. Public humiliation at billionaire's party. Former wife's stunning corporate move. Words that carved into his carefully polished legacy like knives, leaving credibility and reputation to bleed out for the world to watch. Finally, Marcus forced himself to pick up his phone. He called his head of PR first, straight to voicemail. He hung up, called again, still nothing. Next, his attorney. Voicemail. Then his CFO. No answer. They weren't just busy. They were gone, backing away from the smoldering wreckage like lifeboats slipping off a sinking ship, putting distance between themselves and the man everyone now blamed. Loyalty, he realized bitterly, was a commodity with an expiration date, and nothing made it spoil faster than public disgrace. He opened his email, scrolling through frantic press releases, lukewarm statements from board members, internal memos already leaked to every news outlet that would listen. It was worse than he'd feared. Victor Langston hadn't just withdrawn his funding, he'd knocked out the keystone. In the vacuum, secondary investors had followed suit within hours. The dominoes fell so quickly, Marcus hadn't even had time to brace for the impact. Now rumors churned like sharks in the water. Secret board meetings without him, audits ordered overnight, whispers of takeovers and hostile buyers circling like vultures. Langford Consolidated wasn't buckling under a rival's attack. It was crumbling under the weight of perception. Public trust dissolving with every fresh headline. He paced the study, breath ragged, hands shaking so violently he had to brace them against the back of a velvet chair. He had built this empire with cold strategy, deal by deal, handshake by handshake. But he had never planned for this. For pride to rot it from within, for humiliation to turn the people he'd discarded into the architects of his ruin. Helena's face surfaced in his mind. Not the wife he'd once half-remembered in passing, but the figure who had stood silent while his kingdom splintered beneath her calm gaze. She was on every news channel that morning, standing beside Victor outside a glass tower downtown, a hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth as the cameras snapped and reporters swarmed. No theatrics, no bitter monologue, no hunger for petty revenge, just grace. Composure. A presence that spoke louder than anything Marcus could have screamed in defense. She didn't need to gloat, she didn't need to speak at all. Her poise did the talking. And the contrast between that unshaken elegance and the broken man Marcus Langford had become was painfully clear. And the entire world was watching. They always did. The public never looked away from a scandal. If anything, they sharpened their focus with a hunger only ruin could feed. News outlets dissected every second of the gala, replaying grainy footage, slowing down body language, speculating endlessly about Helena's involvement in Victor's bombshell decision. Social media caught fire overnight. Some praised Helena's grace and quiet resolve. Others mocked Marcus's arrogance, calling his public mockery of his ex-wife not just cruel, but staggeringly stupid. Hashtags like Helena Rises and Marcus Falls trended for hours, fed by influencers breaking down what they called a masterclass in poetic justice. Financial pundits analyzed the sudden cracks in investor confidence, a cautionary tale of what happens when leadership rots from within. Even daytime talk shows ran segments on the spectacle, framing it as a modern Shakespearean tragedy unraveling live for millions to watch. Back at Crestwood, Marcus felt it all tightening around him. The staff who once greeted him with crisp deference now skirted his gaze. The butler who had once offered a polite nod each morning pretended not to notice him passing. The housekeeper moved through the halls with soft, efficient steps, no warmth, no small talk. The chill that crept through the manor wasn't from the late spring air. It came from the hollow place where respect used to live. He saw how they addressed him now, only when forced, voices hushed, eyes darting away the moment he looked back. He was no longer the king in his castle, just the ghost haunting the ruins of a scandal everyone had seen coming except him. Outside the wrought iron gates, a knot of journalists camped along the hedges. They didn't shout or pound on doors. They didn't have to. Their cameras and drones did the talking, capturing aerial shots of Crestwood Manor now recast as the backdrop of a public unraveling. Marcus drew the curtains closed, retreating deeper into the hushed shadows. The sunlight outside felt too bright, too honest. He couldn't stop replaying it. Aria's silhouette disappearing down the driveway, Helena's calm face beside Victor's, the shifting expressions on guests' faces as the room turned against him, and the way he'd tried, pathetically, to salvage dignity that was already ashes. By late afternoon, the fallout reached his desk. His assistant forwarded him a single-line email. Emergency board meeting, 3 p.m. Link attached. No greeting, no polite framing, not a request, an order. He hit accept and sat motionless, staring at the empty screen in front of him. His empire, his identity, his name, unwinding thread by thread, faster than he could weave it back together. On a whim, desperation or spite, he couldn't tell, he tapped Helena's number. The line rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. What could he possibly say? That he hadn't seen it coming? That he hadn't believed consequences could arrive so suddenly and so publicly? That he'd thought she would fade quietly into the background, not rise into the spotlight he'd always hoarded for himself? He dropped the phone onto the desk, the unanswered call echoing in his mind longer than her voice ever would. He could feel it now, clearer than ever before. Control was gone. And he had given it away, piece by careless piece, to the one woman he'd thought he'd buried in his past. The irony was cruel in its precision. Marcus had spent years proving to himself, and everyone watching, that he had outgrown Helena, that she wasn't enough for the man he had become, that he had moved so far forward she was irrelevant. And yet, in trying to erase her, he had done the opposite. He had placed her at the very center of the narrative. The symbol of everything he'd underestimated, everything he'd thought he'd left behind. The public didn't see her as a victim. They saw her as a woman who had been wronged, humiliated, and who responded not with petty revenge, but with calm brilliance and unshakable dignity. The board meeting began at 6. Marcus joined from his home office, suit jacket thrown over his shoulders, tie askew, eyes hollow. On his screen, rows of unsmiling faces stared back at him. Executives, legal advisors, top shareholders, a jury that had already weighed him and found him wanting. The questions came fast. Damage control, strategy, leadership transition. Some voices kept a polite edge, others abandoned courtesy altogether. No one said the words out loud, but it was clear they were already sketching a blueprint for a future without Marcus Langford at the helm. When the call ended, the soft chime of the disconnection echoed in the quiet room like a closing door. He sat alone, staring past his reflection in the glass at the darkening city skyline. Somewhere out there, beyond the blinking lights that paid him no mind, Helena was living a different chapter, one he never saw coming. Miles away, that same skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls of Langston International's headquarters, a tower of steel and intention, where the noise of scandal barely touched the air. Inside a private executive lounge designed for quiet luxury, Helena stood near a floor-to-ceiling window, a cup of black tea warming her palms as she watched the ribbons of traffic flicker like tiny sparks along the city streets far below. Behind her, Victor Langston approached, his polished shoes barely whispering across the marble floor. He stopped beside her, hands resting loosely in the pockets of his tailored suit. They said nothing at first, the kind of silence that exists only between people who owe each other no explanations. "It's surreal," Helena murmured at last, her voice soft but steady. "How quickly it can all shift, how people who seemed untouchable can fall and not even see the cliff beneath their feet." Victor nodded once, a quiet, knowing gesture. "That's the nature of power, Helena. It's rarely stolen by force. Most of the time, it collapses under its own weight, when it's built on ego instead of substance." She turned slightly to meet his eyes. "Thank you, not just for what you did that night, but for standing by me, for for believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself anymore." "You didn't need my belief," Victor said, his tone gentle but certain. "You only needed a stage. You've always had the strength." Helena smiled faintly, but her gaze drifted past him, toward the endless avenues below. Her thoughts pulled far from the polished marble and glass that now surrounded her. The last few days had unraveled faster than she could fully absorb. The gala that dissolved into scandal, the empire Marcus thought invincible now trembling at every seam, the public finally seeing the truth she had lived with in silence for years. And now, for the first time, Helena was exactly where she was meant to be. Not as someone's shadow, but as her own undeniable force. He had always believed he was untouchable, that consequences were for lesser men. But in all the noise, all the headlines and gossip, Helena had stayed steady, grounded in the quiet truth that none of this was born from revenge. It was the result of something deeper: purpose, integrity, and a reckoning that had arrived right on time. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Victor asked suddenly, breaking the calm between them. Helena's soft chuckle drifted toward the window. "Of course, that dreadful conference in San Diego. You spilled coffee all over your keynote notes. And you offered to rewrite them for me, in under an hour," Victor added, his smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's when I knew you weren't just another executive's wife playing hostess." "I wasn't," Helena agreed, her voice quiet but certain. "But I let myself be treated like one. For far too long." Victor moved over to the bar, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the polished counter. "You were more involved in Langford Consolidated than anyone ever gave you credit for," he said. "Half of those early expansion strategies were yours, not his, and he never acknowledged it, not once." Helena traced the rim of her teacup, eyes distant but clear. "I was his sounding board, his editor, his fixer when he screwed up, but never his equal, not in his mind." Victor's gaze softened. "He was terrified you'd outshine him. Men like Marcus don't know how to stand beside strong women. They only know how to compete with them." She paused, absorbing it, letting it settle. "I didn't plan any of this, Victor. After the divorce, all I wanted was peace, distance. But when you called me, when you said you were thinking about pulling your investments, I realized it was never just about him anymore. It was about taking back the space he stole from me. Quietly, strategically, without becoming him." Victor crossed the room and handed her a slim folder. "These are the final documents for your onboarding. You'll have full access to the development division. I want you heading our entire innovation branch." Helena took the folder, flipped it open, skimming the headings and signatures. It felt real in her hands, weighty and certain. A doorway to the future she'd once convinced herself she wasn't allowed to have. "Are you sure?" she asked, though deep down she already knew his answer. "I wouldn't have asked if I wasn't," Victor said firmly. "I've watched you navigate rooms full of men who call themselves visionaries, and you're the one who actually sees past the numbers. You've shown the entire world, especially this week, that your leadership doesn't come from ego. It comes from purpose." She closed the folder and laid it gently on the marble table. "Marcus won't forgive this." "Let him try," Victor said with an almost amused shrug. "Let him rage, let him spin his stories. But don't let it weigh on you. His downfall was his own doing, not yours." Helena nodded slowly. She knew he was right, but part of her still carried the old bruises. The echo of years spent shrinking herself beside a man who saw her as an asset, not an equal. She had spent so long questioning her worth, her mind, her right to stand in a room like this and lead without needing permission. And now, for the first time, she knew she never had to ask again. Approval. Standing there, in that bright corner office high above the city, Helena finally allowed herself to let go of the version of her who had once begged for validation from a man who had never deserved it. Later that evening, she stepped into her new office. It wasn't as sprawling or decadent as Marcus's had been, but it was filled with light, with calm, with purpose. She set a few books on the shelf, a framed photo of her parents on the desk. Then, she lowered herself into the leather chair behind her new workspace. She ran her fingertips over the polished desk, a simple piece, sturdy, nothing ostentatious. She could almost see her reflection in the surface, but instead of the faint ghost she'd once been, she saw a woman she recognized now. Steady, deliberate, enough on her own. A tight knot she hadn't realized she still carried in her chest finally began to loosen. It was symbolic, yes, but it was also exactly right. For the first time in years, she wasn't a silent pillar, propping up someone else's empire. She was building her own. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual restless hum. But Helena knew everything had changed. She wasn't just the woman who had endured public humiliation. She was the woman who had wielded grace like a blade, who had dismantled an empire not with scandal or revenge, but with truth. And as Marcus was now learning, truth could be far more devastating than revenge ever was. The days that followed moved strangely for Marcus. They didn't pass quickly enough to distract him from the wreckage closing in on him, but they slipped away just fast enough to steal any chance at a clean redemption before it was too late. Each morning, he woke not to the low hum of a world that once bent to him, but to silence. A heavy, echoing silence that filled every polished hallway of Crestwood Manor. The house was still draped in imported marble, its walls hung with priceless art collected from every corner of the globe, but its soul was gone. The staff still worked, but they moved slowly now, mechanically, eyes downcast, their conversations reduced to murmurs behind closed doors. No warmth, no deference. Every corner felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a man who no longer inspired respect, only pity. Marcus sat at the grand dining table each morning, a steaming cup of coffee untouched beside a breakfast he never tasted. The folded newspaper sat within reach, but he never bothered to unfold it. He didn't need ink and headlines to confirm what he already knew. His face was no longer confined to the financial pages. It bled into gossip columns, tabloid blogs, and chirpy morning talk shows. He was no longer a visionary. He was a cautionary tale, a lesson in arrogance undone not by crime or scandal, but by the simple, brutal truth that he had failed to see real worth where it had always been. The headlines didn't speak of betrayal or elaborate conspiracies. They spoke of poetic justice, of a woman who had stepped from the shadows not to destroy but to transcend. Helena's image was everywhere now, but never in the sordid, scandal-soaked light he once feared. Business journals analyzed her strategic insight. Financial editors praised her restraint and clarity. Even lifestyle magazines ran profiles celebrating her quiet grace under public pressure. The world adored a comeback story, and Helena had given them one they'd never seen before. A story where the protagonist didn't shout, didn't strike back in rage, didn't chase revenge, but simply stood her ground and let the truth do the work. And the world had understood. She had become something larger than the pain she'd endured. A symbol of quiet resilience, of dignity, of the kind of strength that didn't need to be loud to be unmistakable. One late afternoon, while Marcus sat in his home office, staring blankly at the far wall, a knock sounded against the heavy oak of Crestwood's front door. He didn't move at first, assuming it was another courier dropping off legal paperwork, or a letter from yet another attorney. But the knock came again. Measured, patient. With a reluctant exhale, he forced himself to stand, each step through the echoing hallway, pressing into his ribs like a weight he couldn't set down. When he opened the door, the last person he expected to see was standing there. Helena. She wasn't dressed for war. She wasn't dressed for triumph. She wore a simple navy coat over a cream blouse and tailored slacks, understated, elegant, unassuming. Her hair was tied back loosely, her makeup soft and natural. She didn't smile. She didn't frown either. Her expression was calm, composed, and unreadable. Marcus just stared, half expecting she might dissolve into another ghost born of regret and exhaustion. Helena! His voice cracked, dry from days of silence. "May I come in?" she asked, her tone gentle, but leaving him no room to refuse. Wordlessly, he stepped aside. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floors as she crossed the foyer, her eyes skimming over the house she had once called home. It felt smaller to her now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. The walls that once towered felt desperate in their grandeur. The chandeliers seemed like gaudy reminders of a truth she no longer needed to fear. She walked into the sitting room and lowered herself gracefully onto the edge of the couch. Marcus remained standing, caught between sitting and pacing, hands clenching the back of a nearby chair for balance. "I didn't expect to ever see you here again," he said finally, the admission tumbling out before he could tame it. I didn't come to gloat, Helena said. Her voice was quiet, clear. I didn't come to remind you what you lost or to stand here like some victory you have to acknowledge. Then, why? His words wavered, but she heard them. I came to say goodbye, the kind we never really had. Marcus lowered his eyes, his knuckles whitening on the chair. You didn't have to? I know. She looked at him, and for a fleeting second he saw the woman he had taken for granted for so long. And then he saw someone entirely new, someone whole. But I wanted to. He studied her face, searching for the hurt he once relied on, the wounds he once thought made him important in her life. But there was none. She looked more luminous than he remembered, not because of jewels or designer silk, but because of the unmistakable ease of someone who no longer carried the weight of proving herself to a man like him. You're different, he whispered, the words tasting like regret on his tongue. He said it quietly. No, Helena replied, her voice even, her eyes steady. I'm the same. You just never really saw me. Those words struck him harder than any brutal headline, harder than any investor walking out, any boardroom mutiny. Because she wasn't wrong. He had seen her as a constant, a safe ornament, steady but forgettable. He'd never truly seen the woman who had quietly held the bones of his empire together, who had swallowed every dismissal and every insult, who had let herself be invisible in a room where she could have easily outshone him all along. I was a fool, Marcus murmured, shame crackling through his chest like a spark catching dry timber. I thought moving on meant I was winning. I thought I was building something better, but all I did was hollow out everything that mattered. Helena didn't rush to answer him. She let the words linger in the room, not to punish him, but because they deserved to echo where so much denial had once lived. Finally, she said, sometimes people don't understand value until it's lost. And sometimes it takes losing everything to see what you never truly appreciated. He sank into a chair, shoulders bowing under the weight he'd carried too late. His eyes shone with something dangerously close to tears. Did you plan all of this with Victor from the beginning? He asked, voice cracking under the question. No. Helena shook her head gently. I didn't know what he was going to do that night. But when he offered me a chance to step forward, I realized it was time to live my own life, to stop letting other people define it, including you. She paused then, looking at him, not with triumph, not with cruelty, but with a quiet pity for the man who had wasted so much love trying to be bigger than he ever needed to be. Part of her would always grieve for the years lost to silence, but none of that sorrow would ever bind her again. Marcus held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then, in a voice so raw it almost broke the air, he asked, Do you hate me? She exhaled softly and shook her head. No, Marcus. I don't hate you. I just don't carry you with me anymore. That landed deeper than hate ever could have. Not her anger, not her revenge, but the gentle finality that she no longer belonged to his story at all. She rose, adjusting her coat, lifting her purse from the table. Marcus stood too, though he didn't know why. There was nothing left to hold on to. Goodbye, Marcus, she said, her voice as soft as a closing door. He swallowed hard, nodding once. Goodbye, Helena. She turned and walked to the foyer. She paused only briefly, eyes passing over the once impressive art and chandeliers that had tried too hard to prove something. They felt like hollow trophies now, echoes of a world she'd outgrown. She stepped outside just as a break in the clouds let sunlight spill across the driveway. Her car waited quietly at the curb. She got in, closed the door, and never once looked back. Inside Crestwood, Marcus drifted back to his chair and sank into the silence. He sat there for a long time, hearing the ghost of her footsteps on the marble floor long after they were gone. For the first time in his life, he understood real loss. Not the loss of wealth or clout or headlines, but the loss of someone who had quietly held everything together, without ever needing credit for doing so. That night, the hush inside the mansion deepened. And in that stillness, Marcus Langford finally learned that not all defeats come in scandal or fire. Some come quietly. Some come in the shape of a woman walking away with her head high, leaving only the echo of what might have been. Across the city, the streets pulsed with their usual restless rhythm, oblivious to one man's ruin and one woman's quiet rebirth. On the 20th floor of a glass-wrapped tower, Helena sat at her new desk, the late afternoon sun flooding the room in warm gold. Her office wasn't showy. It lacked the marble and heavy chandeliers Marcus had once flaunted, but it radiated something better: purpose, clarity, and a future she would build on her own terms. The walls held no framed awards, no oversized art pieces meant to dazzle visitors into submission. Instead, shelves lined with books on innovation, sustainable leadership, and human-centered strategy filled the space with quiet purpose. A few healthy plants softened the clean, modern edges. On Helena's desk sat only what mattered: her laptop, a leather-bound notebook, a simple glass paperweight that had once belonged to her father, and a single photograph. One of her standing arm in arm with a group of women she had mentored through a non-profit business initiative years ago, long before Marcus's world had swallowed hers whole. It was early. The city was only beginning to stretch and stir, but Helena was already there, as she always was. Not to prove herself, not to be seen, but because this was hers now, her time, her terms, her foundation. For the first time in years, she didn't wake to someone else's chaos. She didn't spend her days performing invisible labor to prop up a man too enamored with his own reflection to see the hands steadying the mirror. She wasn't a strategist, hidden behind the throne anymore. She was the architect now. And the story ahead of her lay blank and waiting. Helena leaned back in her chair, letting the quiet settle around her like an old friend. She thought of the week before, standing in front of Langston International's full board, not as a token presence or an honorary name on a plaque, but as a decisive voice in shaping what came next. She had spoken on ethical business transitions in emerging markets, a topic she'd researched alone, late at night, back when she still played the role of silent advisor to Marcus Langford's ambitions. When she finished, the room hadn't clapped immediately, not out of indifference, but because they were actually listening, absorbing every word. And when the board chair finally spoke, all he'd said was, "Welcome home." The words still echoed somewhere deep in her chest. Later that same day, she'd met with a small group of young entrepreneurs, 3 women, 2 men, all bright-eyed and brimming with vision, but hungry for a guide. She listened, challenged them gently, offered direction without dictating it. Afterward, one young woman lingered behind while the others filed out. She was soft-spoken, nervous but determined. "Can I ask you something?" she ventured. "Of course," Helena said, closing her notebook and giving the girl her full attention. How did you get here? After everything? How did you not just give up?" Helena paused, choosing her truth with care. "I did give up," she said plainly. "For a while, I gave up on myself, on the idea that I had anything worth building on my own. I thought silence was strength. Endurance without purpose is just slow erasure," Helena said gently. "I didn't want to disappear quietly. I wanted to rise, intentionally." Helena nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You make it look effortless." "It's not," Helena said with a quiet laugh. "But it's worth it." That evening, Helena returned to her apartment, a warm, welcoming space that overlooked a small park where she liked to walk after long days. She didn't miss the old mansion. She didn't miss its tall gates, its manicured gardens that once felt like luxury but had long become barriers. Here, in this sunlit apartment, she had crafted something real. Furniture chosen for comfort, not to impress. Books stacked on side tables, a record player humming low jazz on nights when the world felt too sharp. Her kitchen smelled faintly of basil and garlic, not from catered trays or hired chefs, but from her own hands. She cooked for herself now, not out of need, but because she loved the ritual, the rhythm of chopping herbs, the hum of the stove, the scent winding through the air like a new memory, overriding the old ones. She set the table for one without sadness, only certainty. There was a quiet power in choosing her own solitude, not as loneliness, but as space she no longer had to share with ghosts of who she'd once been. She sat by the window with a cup of tea as twilight settled over the park, and for once she did not think of Marcus Langford. She didn't think of the empire that had once required her silence to stand. Instead, she thought of the small victories that had led her here. The people who had cheered her on in the background. The assistant who once slipped kind notes under her office door. The friend who reminded her of her worth when the divorce felt like drowning. The investor who had seen her clearly when she'd forgotten how to see herself. And most of all, she thought of the version of herself who used to wake up each morning, dreading another day spent being invisible. That woman hadn't been destroyed. She had evolved. Across the city, Marcus still scrambled to salvage the scraps of his legacy, corralling board members into crisis calls, pushing out statements polished by legal teams instead of his own voice. He gave a televised interview once, his first since the implosion. The anchor's questions cut deeper than he expected. His answers were smooth but empty. The spark behind his eyes had dulled. The arrogance that had once draped around him like armor was gone. He spoke of resilience, of rebuilding, of new directions. But everyone could hear what he didn't say. The empire was fractured. The myth of the man behind it was fading fast. Helena watched the interview in silence. When it ended, she switched off the TV and returned to her book. Not out of coldness, but because that chapter no longer belonged to her story. She didn't hate him. She didn't wish him ruin. She simply refused to let him define anything about her anymore. On Friday, she stepped onto a brightly lit stage at a leadership summit and gave a keynote address titled "The Power of Stillness in a Noisy World." The audience rose to their feet when she finished, not because she'd performed, but because she'd told the truth. She spoke of identity, of grace, of the quiet ways women silence themselves in rooms they were meant to lead. She spoke of rebuilding, not for revenge, but for clarity and peace. She never once said Marcus's name. She didn't have to. Everyone listening understood. Afterwards, a young journalist caught up with her backstage. "They're calling you the Quiet Revolution," he said, wide-eyed. "How do you feel about that?" Helena smiled. "If I'm a revolution," she said, "then I hope it shows people that strength doesn't have to roar to be heard." That night, she walked home under the hum of city lights. She paused by a bookstore window where a new release sat propped up, stories about resilience, reinvention, second chances. She didn't need to read it. She was already living it. And somewhere far beyond the headlines and boardrooms, in the calm heart of a life she had finally reclaimed, Helena understood something that Marcus never would. The best revenge was never about destruction or spectacle. It was peace. So the story is over now. And if you're still here with me, reading or listening at this hour, then I know something in Helena's journey must have stirred your heart too. My dear friends, let's sit with that feeling for a moment. This was never just a tale about a powerful man losing his crown. It was about a woman quietly reclaiming her own, not with revenge or rage, but with grace, timing, and the courage to stop letting someone else write her worth. Life, in many ways, tests us just like Helena. Sometimes the deepest strength is the kind that doesn't roar. It whispers, it stands its ground, and it lets the truth do the talking when the world is too noisy to listen. As the poet Rumi said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." So maybe tonight, let's remember, endurance without purpose is just slow erasure. Don't stay small so someone else can feel big. Don't waste your silence on people who never deserved your voice. Helena's quiet power reminds us that healing isn't about destroying others. It's about rising so high that what hurt you can't reach you anymore. Peace, my friends, is the best kind of revenge and the most beautiful kind of freedom. So, if this story touched you, if it made you reflect on your own moments of silence and how you can turn them into strength, then please like this video, share it with someone who needs this reminder tonight, and subscribe to our channel. We have so many more true stories and quiet revolutions to share with you. Stay strong, stand tall, and always remember, the story you choose to live can be the calmest, yet most powerful storm. Thank you for being here with me.